Montana Territory, July 1882. Willara Whitlow gripped the reins tighter as the mare stumbled on the rocky trail, her skirts ripped and dust-soaked from 2 days of hard riding. The sun blazed high over the bitterroots, but cold sweat clung to her back. She had not slept since she left the ranch near Miles City, not really. Not since she'd slipped out of her father's house while the rest of the household slept, leaving only a note behind. She was supposed to marry Thaddeus Ellery in 5 days. A man 3 decades older, hands like a butcher and breath that reeked of cigars and rot. Her father called it a fine match, said it would secure the family's fortunes, said her feelings did not matter. She had never felt smaller than when she signed her name to that marriage agreement. But she was not small now. Not anymore. She was somewhere in the mountains, far from every name she had ever been called. The mare's legs trembled beneath her. Willara spotted a creek ahead narrow, but the water was clear and nudged the horse toward it. The animal drank greedily while Willara dropped beside it, cupping water to her lips with shaking hands. Her braid hung heavy over her shoulder, streaked with dust and pine needles. "Do not move." The voice came from the trees. Deep, steady, close. Willara froze. A man stepped into view, rifle held low but ready. He was tall, built like someone who worked with axes and ropes all day. His shirt was faded blue, sleeves rolled back to his elbows, and his dark hair curled damp at his neck. He did not look angry, just cautious. "You lost?" he asked. "No," Willara said, her voice cracked. "Not exactly." He looked at her mare, then at her torn dress and raw hands. "You sure?" "I need a place to rest for a bit, just a few days." He lowered the rifle. "Name's Bram McCready, my cabin is up that ridge. You can come if you are honest about why you are running." "I am not dangerous," he studied her face. "I believe you, but I still need to know." She hesitated, then stood. "My name is Willara Whitlow. I was supposed to marry a man I did not choose. I left before they could make me." Bram nodded once. "All right." They reached his cabin near dusk. It was small, tucked between spruce trees with a porch and a stone chimney that still smoked. A single horse stood tied to the post out front, and the scent of pine sap clung to the breeze. Inside was neat wooden table, narrow cot, shelves lined with jars, and a well-used cook stove. "You can take the bed," Bram said, setting down his rifle. "I will sleep out here tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already rolling out a blanket near the fire. She slept for 16 hours straight. By the time Willara woke, Bram had chopped wood, boiled coffee, and set a tin plate of cornbread and beans on the table. "You slept like someone who needed it," he said. She nodded, still blinking off the fog of dreams. "Thank you." He slid the plate closer. "You are safe here, Willara." She ate in silence while Bram sat across the room, carving something from a block of pine. She watched the slow sweep of his knife, the way his fingers moved with care, not hurry. She stayed 3 days. Then 4. She helped grind cornmeal, hung linens to dry, and mended a rip in Bram's shirt. He showed her how to set snares, and she listened as he told her about his late brother, the war, the way he had come to these mountains to start over. She never asked for details, and he never offered more than he wanted to. But she could see the weight he carried. The quiet way he watched the trees, always alert, the way he kept his hands gentle, as if afraid they might not always be. One night, rain beat against the roof, and Bram came inside soaked and shivering. He had gone out to check the traps and slipped into a stream. Willara helped him pull off his boots, fetched dry clothes, and made him sit by the fire while she wrapped a blanket around him. He looked up at her, eyes tired but warm. "You did not have to. I wanted to." Something shifted between them then, quiet but clear. The next morning she found a wooden carving on the table. A small bird, wings tucked in, smooth and perfect. She picked it up, held it close. "You made this?" Bram glanced up from the porch where he was sanding a new stool. "Seemed like something you would like," she swallowed. "I do." That night she sat beside him on the porch while the sky turned orange behind the mountains. "I cannot go back," she said softly. "You do not have to." "I do not know what comes next." Bram turned toward her. "You have a place here if you want it." She looked at him, really looked. at the way his eyes steadied when they met hers, at the way he never tried to take anything from her, only offered. "I do," she whispered. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. He took her hand, slow and sure. And for the first time in her life, Willara felt chosen not as a bargain, not as a burden, but as herself. They sat that way until the stars came out. She had escaped the life planned for her, and here, in the quiet of the mountains, she had found something better, a kind man. A safe place, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of love. Willara stood barefoot in the damp grass behind the cabin, sleeves rolled above her elbows as she scrubbed Bram's shirts in the creek-fed basin. The summer sun had softened its edge with the turn toward evening, and the air smelled of crushed mint and moss. A pair of crows argued in the trees behind her, but she worked with steady hands, pressing the cloth against the washboard with a rhythm that soothed. Behind her, Bram's voice broke the quiet. "You always work like you aim to prove something." She didn't turn. "I do." He stepped closer, the sound of his boots soft in the grass. "To who?" "To myself, mostly." She wrung out the shirt, water arcing from the fabric. "Out there, I was always told what I was worth. Here, I get to decide." Bram crouched beside her and dipped his hands in the basin. "You don't owe me anything, you know that." "I know." She looked at him now. His forearms were speckled with sawdust and his collar still damp from sweat. "But I want to be useful." "You already are." Willara swallowed and bent to the next shirt, her jaw tightening. "I'm not used to being seen like that." Bram didn't speak again until she was rinsing the last shirt. "I could use help with the roof tomorrow. Shingles near the chimney came loose." She straightened. "Show me how." He nodded, a small lift of his brows like he hadn't expected her to say yes so quickly. That night, Willara sat on the cabin step, combing the knots from her hair by lantern light. She watched Bram rub linseed oil into the handle of a drawknife, his motions patient and unhurried. "What was your mother like?" she asked. He paused, glanced up. "Quiet woman, taught me to listen more than speak, grew vegetables better than most men raise cattle. Do you miss her?" "Every day." Willara rested the comb in her lap. "Mine died when I was 11. She played piano." Said music softened a house. "Do you play?" She shook her head. "Not since she passed. My father sold the piano before the year was out." Bram looked at her across the lamplight, his face unreadable. "That's a shame. A house ought to hold on to whatever softens it." They didn't speak again until the lantern burned low. The next morning, Willara followed Bram up a ladder onto the cabin roof, her braid tied in a knot beneath her hat. The sun was still behind the ridge and the shingles were cool beneath their boots. "Careful on the pitch," Bram said, handing her a hammer. "It's not steep, but it's slick if the sap's fresh." She crouched beside him, watching as he pried up a warped shingle. Her own hands followed, clumsy at first, but steadier with each one. They worked until midday. At one point she lost her balance, shifting her weight, and grabbed Bram's arm. He didn't flinch. "I've got you," he said, quiet. She nodded, breath caught in her throat, and didn't let go right away. When they climbed down, Bram brought out a loaf of soda bread from the cupboard and cut 2 thick slices, spreading blackberry preserves between them. They sat at the table, boots dusty, shoulders sun-warmed. "You ever think about what you want long-term?" he asked, voice low. "I want to build something that's mine, not handed to me, not decided for me." He nodded slowly. "Reckon there's room here for 2 people building something." She met his eyes. "You think so? I know it." The next few days passed in quiet tasks. Willara patched a tear in the cabin's curtain. Bram caught a hare near the ridge and roasted it with onions. A letter arrived by a trapper passing through a sheet of paper with her father's seal, unopened and laid on the shelf untouched. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. One evening, a soft thunder rolled in from the west and Bram stood in the doorway watching the sky. Willara joined him, her shoulder brushing his as she leaned close. He glanced at her. "Storm's not far off." "I don't mind the rain." He looked at her a long moment, then reached for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers folding into his like they'd known each other longer than they had. "You're not alone anymore," he said, and she knew he meant more than the storm. By mid-August, the air in the valley changed. The heat still clung to the afternoons, but mornings came cooler, edged with a breath that hinted at frost not far off. Willara stood behind the cabin in her stocking feet, watching a pair of deer move through the thinning brush. One lifted its head, ears twitching, before fading into the trees like smoke. Inside, Bram was sanding down the new cradle he'd begun without explanation. At first, she assumed it was for barter. He sometimes traded his finer pieces with the trading post 2 days' ride west, but this one he carved slower. His hand moved with a different kind of care. She stepped through the doorway. "You planning to send that to someone?" He didn't look up. "No," she crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Then who's it for?" He set the rasp down, wiped his fingers on a cloth. "Thought maybe if you stayed, we might need one. Someday." Willara's breath caught, not for fear, not for pressure. But because he said it like it was a hope, not a demand. Like he'd already pictured her here, seasons from now, and didn't mind waiting for whatever came. She stepped inside, walked up to the cradle, and ran her hand along the curved edge. "You think far ahead." "I try to." "Doesn't always mean I get it right. You did this time." He met her eyes then, and something passed between them, quiet as breath, certain as stone. That night, she brought in the last of the summer onions from the small patch behind the cabin. She laid them out on the table in neat rows, brushing the dirt from each one. Bram came in behind her, scent of cedar clinging to his shirt. "You ever miss anything from back east?" she asked. He leaned against the table, folding his arms. "Not much, maybe music, fiddle mostly. Used to be one that played at our barn dances." "I've never danced," she said. "Not properly, you'd be good at it." She laughed softly. "You don't know that. I know how you move when you're working. Balance like that always carries over." She busied her hands with the onions again, but her cheeks warmed. "I used to wonder what it'd be like, dancing in the open, not a ballroom, somewhere real." Bram walked to the cupboard and pulled out a tin box she hadn't seen before. "I made something once. Thought it'd be useful someday." He opened the lid and took out a small wooden whistle. "Not a fiddle, but it'll do." He blew a few notes, rough at first, then steadier. The tune was simple, slow, and carried through the room like wind through pine. Willara stepped toward him, unsure. He offered his hand. "No marble floors," he said. "No eyes watching, just me." She rested her fingers in his, and he guided her gently, steps unhurried. The whistle's tune faded, but they kept moving. Her hand on his shoulder, his palm at her waist, her breath light against the hollow of his throat. "You built a life here," she said. "I built a shell of one, you gave it shape." They stood in the hush that followed, too close to pretend it meant nothing. "I've been thinking," she whispered. "About staying." His voice was rough. "You already have." The next morning, she didn't rise early. Instead, she lay in the cot while he lit the stove and ground oats for breakfast. When she did join him, he was stirring honey into their porridge. "I want to plant more next spring," she said. "Potatoes, maybe squash." "There's room for both," he answered. "And I could mend that second shed if we cleared it out, use it for drying herbs." He turned. "You're thinking like someone with a future here." She met his gaze. "I am." That afternoon, they walked the ridge behind the cabin. The air was sharper at the height, and the trees thinned to reveal the valley stretched below, golden and green. Willara stood at the edge, hair pulled back with a length of twine, eyes scanning the slopes. "I used to think I'd never be free," she said. "That every road had already been chosen for me." Bram stepped beside her. "You chose this one. I chose you." His hand found hers. "And I chose you right back." She looked out over the trees, the scattered light, the place she now called home. A place she'd earned, not by running, but by arriving. And standing there with Bram, she knew she never had to run again. The first snow came early that year, a thin veil over the ground that melted by noon but lingered in the shadows between trees. Willara stood inside the cabin, fingers red from the morning's water haul, watching her breath curl in the air before Bram stoked the stove high again. The logs crackled and caught, warmth blooming back into the room. "You said there's a trapline near the east draw," she said, drying her hands on the hem of her apron. "Show me." Bram tucked the last of the kindling into the bin. "It's a half-day walk there and half back. We'd need to take the rifles," she nodded. "I want to learn more before winter sets in. If something happens to you, I should know where to check." He looked up, quiet for a moment. "All right, we'll leave after breakfast." They packed dried venison and a wedge of cheese, wrapped in cloth and tucked into her satchel. The rifles hung across their backs, barrels tied with leather cords. The trail east wasn't marked, but Bram moved like he'd memorized the land decades ago. Willara kept close, watching his steps, noting the way he read the slope of the land, how he paused to listen when the wind shifted. They crossed a frozen stream where the ice crackled underfoot, then climbed into thicker timber where elk tracks dotted the snow. At the first snare, an empty loop hung limp between two saplings. "You ever trap before?" he asked, crouching to reset the tension. "No. I've dressed rabbits, but only after they came from someone else's hands. You'll learn. Most of it's patience. The rest is knowing what the animal needs more than it knows itself." She crouched beside him, fingering the wire. "That sounds like how men talk about marriage contracts." Bram didn't laugh. He looked at her instead, long and steady. "That's not what this is." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." They found a pine marten in the third snare, already stiff. Bram skinned it with practiced speed, wrapping the pelt in oilskin and burying the remains away from the trail. As they walked, Willara asked, "What else do you do out here when the snow sets in?" "Carve. Read sometimes. If I'm lucky, someone brings a book to barter. Last winter I traded for one about riverboats on the Mississippi." He glanced at her. "You like stories?" "I used to read by candlelight when I was young, before the house filled with people who only spoke of money." "You miss anything from that life?" She shook her head. "Only the quiet parts." They reached the far ridge by mid-afternoon, where the trees opened and the valley stretched wide below. The sun dipped low, throwing long shadows over the land, and a hawk circled above the distant pines. Willara sat on a fallen log and pulled the satchel to her lap, unwrapping the cheese. Bram sat beside her, close enough for warmth, not touching. "Do you think you'll ever leave this place?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've already left too many things behind. This is where I was meant to stop." She handed him a piece of bread. "I'm glad you stopped before I got here." He took it, eyes on the horizon. "It's not just the land, you know, it's the life I've built on it, and the people I let into it." She set her hand on his knee, not tentative. "You're the first person I've ever trusted to stay." He covered her hand with his grip firm. "Then let's keep building something we don't have to run from." They stayed until the sun fell behind the ridge, until the cold crept into the seams of their coats. On the walk back, Willara moved with confidence, remembering each twist in the path, each landmark. She didn't ask for direction again. That night, she boiled dried apples with cinnamon, filling the cabin with a scent that made the walls feel closer, safer. Bram sat at the table, repairing the stitching on his glove. She brought him a bowl and sat across from him. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life trying to endure things." "You're not enduring anymore," he said. "You're living. And you," his gaze didn't waver. "I'm loving." She reached across the table, her thumb brushing the thin scar on the side of his hand. "Then we're both doing something right." Outside, the wind picked up, but the fire was strong and the shutters held. Inside, they didn't speak again, but the silence between them was full. Not empty, not waiting, it was enough. It was everything. The wind had dropped by morning, leaving a crust of frost on the cabin sill. Willara pressed her palm to the glass, watching the sunlight melt the white film from the edge of the woodpile. Bram was outside, splitting kindling with a short-handled axe, sleeves rolled past the elbow of his worn wool shirt. She noted the slight hitch in his left shoulder as he swung something new, likely from the fall when he'd braced himself on the trail a few days ago. She stepped out with 2 mugs in hand, steam curling from the tin rims. "You're favoring that side," she said, offering him one. "It'll ease by tomorrow." "And if it doesn't," he took a sip, eyes on the slope beyond the trees. "Then I'll favor it better." She didn't laugh. "You don't have to do everything yourself." He set the mug on the stump. I'm not used to anyone watching close enough to notice. She reached for his hand, thumb brushing along a callus near his knuckle. You are now. They walked down to the creek together, a bucket swinging between them. The water ran thinner than it had weeks ago, and the stones beneath it were slick with green. Willara crouched to test the flow. Next year we'll need to build a better way to draw from it, she said. Something that won't freeze over come January, a trough line or a spring box. I read about one once. If we pack it with gravel and lay a drain pipe, the water stays moving. He looked at her, impressed. You've been thinking ahead. I've been thinking like I plan to keep living here. They spent the afternoon laying down the last of the root vegetables in the cool shed, packing each layer with straw. Bram moved slower than usual, and when he stood too fast, he steadied himself against the doorframe. Willara didn't say anything this time. She just handed him a folded cloth to bind his shoulder and began sorting through the blue corn they'd dried weeks before. That night, she brought out the quilt they'd stitched together in late August and spread it over the cot. The corners were uneven, the pattern lopsided, but the seams had held. She ran her hand over the dark red square near the center one of Bram's old shirts, frayed at the collar. He leaned in the doorway, arms folded. You've made this place more than I ever managed. I didn't do it alone. He stepped forward, his voice low. You still haven't said if you'll marry me. You haven't asked. I wanted you to see what life with me would look like through the lean months. I've seen. He knelt beside her, the floor creaking under his weight. Then I'll ask now, not because I need to, but because I want to. Willara Whitlow, will you stay through all of it? Hard winters, quiet days, and whatever comes after. She set her hand to his cheek, her voice steady. I will. They married on the last Sunday before the first heavy snow. No preacher, no papers. Just Bram's hand in hers and a promise beneath the bare-limbed cottonwood behind the cabin. He carved 2 rings from river-worn ironwood and tied them with a strip of suede until they could be sized proper. Willara wore hers on a leather cord around her neck, close to her skin. That evening they sat together by the fire, her head resting against his chest, while he read aloud from the only novel they had, a tattered volume found in a trapper's trade bag, its spine held with wax thread. His voice was slow, careful, the rhythm unhurried, as if the story mattered less than the act of sharing it. By spring, the cradle he'd built had a place at the foot of the bed. Willara stood often with her hand resting on its edge, not yet filled but full of promise. One morning she returned from the creek with a pail of meltwater, cheeks flushed with cold. Bram was at the table, writing in a small ledger they used to track planting. He looked up as the door shut behind her. The trapper came by, he said. Said your father passed through Miles City not long ago, headed south, didn't leave word. Willara set the pail down. I don't expect he would, Bram nodded. I thought you'd want to know. She crossed the room, leaned against his shoulder. He's gone from my life either way. They planted squash and beans in May, and a month later, a letter arrived by a passing cattleman. It bore no seal, only a folded paper scrawled in a woman's hand a friend Willara had once known from town, now settled in Helena. She had read of Willara's escape, of the scandal, and simply wrote, I hope you found something better. Willara burned the letter in the stove and didn't answer. By midsummer, the garden yielded enough to share. Bram built a drying rack for herbs behind the cabin, and Willara traded sage bundles with an Assiniboine woman who passed through with her sons. They spoke a few words in common, and when Willara offered her a small tin of lard, the woman pressed a strip of smoked meat into her palm and nodded once, deep and silent. That night, Bram tucked his hand over her belly, warm and steady. It's been a year, he said. She turned to face him. I know. You still sure, her voice didn't waver, about you, always. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath, soft and alive. Inside, the hearth glowed low, casting long shadows along the floor. He kissed her then, slow and certain. Not out of desire, though that lived between them too, but out of the deep, patient love that had grown between wood smoke and mended seams, between shared burdens and quiet trust. In the months that followed, they built a small smokehouse beside the tool shed and added a second window to the cabin's north wall. Willara began keeping a ledger of her own, not of crops or trade, but of stories, of how things had changed, of what she had learned, and of the life she had chosen. By the time the second snow fell, the cradle no longer sat empty. Bram carved a toy bird for their daughter's first winter, smooth and small enough for her fist. Willara wrapped her in a shawl sewn from scraps of her old riding skirt and sang songs she remembered from her mother's piano, notes soft and halting but true. They lived quiet, steady, and full. The kind of life that didn't make its way into newspapers or ledgers, but into the corners of memory where love settles deep, and they never looked back.